Uchino and I could not explain our reasons, so we wheedled and cajoled until he agreed. When the surplus provisions had been removed, we pulled alongside Yamato for our last fueling. That done, Yahagi drew away to anchor, and the 8 destroyer skippers and 3 division commanders were invited on board for a farewell party. Admiral Komura, genial host on this occasion, no longer scowling and haggard, offered great quantities of sake. He poured each glass, and the party turned into a curious drinking bout, with everyone striving for merriment and gaiety. Old, tired wisecracks were laughed at uproariously. Some officers sang or did tricks or sleight of hand, and each was greeted with cheers and applause. Meanwhile, the sake supply dwindled, yet no one got drunk. The alcohol had no effect. There was boasting of romantic prowess and successes, but despite all efforts, there was no spontaneity in the laughter, and the gathering broke up a couple of hours before midnight, leaving 30 large empty sake bottles. Yet every man walked straight and sober to the ramp and into waiting boats to return to his ship. When the guests had gone, Commander Uchino invited Admiral Komura and me to join a party in the wardroom. There some 20 of Yahagi's senior officers were gathered. We exchanged drinks and toasts with them and absorbed more pints of sake. We sang Navy songs and laughed with these officers, who were less subdued than the older skippers. Uchino joined Komura and me to go to the gunroom next, where the junior officers were having their final party. We had a drink and joined in a song or two. By 23:30, all celebrating in Yahagi was ended, and the celebrants had retired. When Komura, Uchino and I were finally alone, I knew they shared my concern at how Yahagi would respond to the ordeal ahead. The officers all seemed composed enough, but what about the men? We decided to visit their quarters. Lights were out in the cramped, narrow spaces, filled with hundreds of occupied hammocks. There was no sound but the regular drone of snoring as the men slept peacefully. We tiptoed back to the upper deck, and Uchino said, "They are all right. They sleep like children with full trust and confidence in you. They know that you will take care of them, no matter how hazardous our mission." I was overwhelmed and tremendously happy. The vast quantities of alcohol began to work, and I felt dizzy. I staggered and was suddenly drunk. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I clung to a post and shouted, "Nippon Banzai! Yahagi Banzai! Nippon Banzai! Yahagi Banzai! Nippon Banzai!" And that was the last I remember of that unforgettable night. Uchino helped me to my cabin, where I collapsed on the bed. The next day was Friday, the 6th of April, and I awakened at 600. The weather was glorious when I stepped out on deck and breathed deeply. I shook my head vigorously and was surprised to find no trace of a hangover. A soft breeze whipped up small waves on the calm inland sea. A few thousand meters away, radiant cherry blossoms dotted the shore, and distant mountains sparkled under the cobalt sky. This beautiful homeland is worthy of our sacrifices. All ships were abuzz with activity. Yahagi was still occupied with the offloading of non-essential supplies. Small barges and lighters were coming and going all around. Uchino approached and greeted me. "Good morning, Captain." "Good morning, Uchino. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "A bit too beautiful, sir. A B29 flew over at 0100, and there were 2 others at 400. The enemy is keeping close watch on our movements." I nodded silently. This was what I had expected. After standing at the railing for a few minutes looking at the homeland, I dashed to my cabin. There was no time to waste. This was going to be a busy day. Following the daily shipboard routine, we had morning exercises before breakfast, and then the crew lined up on deck to salute the rising sun flag as it was hoisted at the bows of our ship. I returned to my cabin after the ceremony to catch up on accumulated paperwork. There were messages to be read and scores of papers requiring my signature. At 1000 hours, an orderly came to my quarters to say, "Captain Hara, the last courier boat leaves for Tokuyama in 15 minutes. Do you have anything to send?" "Nothing, son. Nothing at all." Alone again, I realized that there should be a farewell letter to my family. There was so much yet little to say, and time was fleeting. In a hasty note, which my wife has to this day, I wrote, "The combined fleet has shrunk unbelievably in the past 2 years. I am about to sortie as skipper of the only cruiser in this fleet, 8,500-ton Yahagi. With my good friend Rear Admiral Keizo Komura on board, we are going on a surface special attack mission. It is a great responsibility as well as a great honour to be skipper of a ship in this sortie to Okinawa. Know that I am happy and proud of this opportunity. Be proud of me. Farewell." I sealed the letter and ran with it to the ramp just before the boat pulled away. Returning to the cabin, I was no longer worried or upset. The sortie no longer occurred to me as a one-way mission. Determined now to fight to the last, I felt we could do it. I looked at the 8 destroyers lying nearby and thought of past days and what these ships had been through. Yukikaze, Snow Wind, had survived many hard battles. She had vied with my Shigure for indestructibility. I recalled the song that had been so popular at Truk and Rabaul, Sasebo's Shigure and Kurei's Yukikaze, immortal and indestructible destroyers. You fulfill the miracle dream of sailors, 2 ships which always return from battle. That song had been a great morale booster for my men. Now Shigure was gone, but Yukikaze would surely continue the miracle. I looked at Suzutsuki, Cool Moon, 3,470 tons, and thought of her amazing record. Completed in late 1942, she had been hit by 2 torpedoes from a submarine on January 16, 1944, near Shikoku, off Bungo Channel. Her bow and stem were shot off, but the Cool Moon refused to sink and somehow made it back to Kura. 9 months later, this same ship was hit by a submarine torpedo off Toizaki, again near Shikoku, and its bow was blown off, but again she made it to Kure and was repaired. A thing repeated will occur a 3rd time, I thought, and chuckled, little knowing how true this would be in the case of Suzutsuki. Hibiki should have been in this force, but she had hit a floating mine early in the morning of April 5th and limped back to Kure. I felt a particular attachment to this little 1,980-ton destroyer and regretted her absence. When the mine-hitting incident was reported, it angered all of us. What a shame that a Japanese destroyer should be damaged by a mine in the inland sea. But B29s had dropped many mines there and in the Sea of Japan. Even home waters were no longer safe. Perhaps this fact had influenced the decision to throw our few remaining ships at Okinawa. Looking at Hatsushimo, I had no suspicion that she would survive this one-way sortie. But she did, only to hit a mine in the Japan Sea on July 30th and become the 129th and last Japanese destroyer sunk in World War II. At 1600, the signal was given to weigh anchor and the 10 ships of the Second Fleet commenced their special attack sortie. Yahagi moved out first, followed by the 3 wind destroyers, Isokaze, Hamakaze, Yukikaze, and Yamato sandwiched between the 2 moons, Fuyutsuki, Suzutsuki, with Asashimo, Kasumi, and Hatsushimo in column astern. As we advanced at a slow 12 knots to avoid the hazard of mines, I surveyed our puny column of ships and realized this would be the last sortie of the Imperial Navy. It made me proud to be in the lead ship. 2 hours later, we entered Bungo Strait between Kyushu and Shikoku. Barely discernible to port was the long cape which formed the westernmost stretch of Shikoku. I bade a silent farewell to this island of my birth. Past the narrow strait, the mine hazard was behind us, and we increased speed. But new hazards soon appeared. 2 B29s, flying high out of gun range, dropped several bombs at our formation. They scored no hits, but their challenge was a grave presentiment of what lay ahead. It made me uneasy to consider that, of our 10 ships, only Yamato and 2 destroyers had anti-aircraft radar. The sets in Yahagi were useful only against surface targets, but there was no time now for such concerns. In each ship the crews were called to the forecastle. On Yahagi's spacious deck, her 1,000 men collected while I briefed them on our mission and read a special message from Admiral Soemu Toyoda, The Imperial Navy is mounting a general offensive against the enemy at Okinawa by mustering in concert with the Army all of Japan's air, sea and ground strength to render this operation a turning point of the war. Every unit and every man is expected to put up an inspiring fight and annihilate the enemy, thereby assuming the continuance of our eternal empire. The fate of our nation rests on this operation. There was no sound but the murmur of engines, the slap of water, and the flutter and snap of the rising sun flag at our bows. I continued, "You have just heard the message from our Commander-in-Chief. I wish to add a few words about our special attack mission. As you know, hundreds of our comrades have flown bomb-laden planes on one-way missions against the enemy. Thousands more of these flyers are standing by at every airfield. Hundreds of our comrades are ready in submarines to man one-way torpedoes. Thousands of others will drive explosive torpedo boats or crawl the bottom of the sea to fasten explosive charges against enemy ships. Our job in this mission is part of the same pattern. Our mission appears suicidal, and it is. But I wish to emphasize that suicide is not the objective. The objective is victory. You are not sheep whipped to a sacrificial altar. We are lions released in the arena to devour the enemy gladiators. You are not to be slain merely as sacrifices for the nation. Do not hesitate to come back alive. We must force our way against any enemy effort to intercept our mission. But you must not give up your lives cheaply. Once this ship is crippled or sunk, do not hesitate to save yourselves for the next fight. There will be other battles. You are not to commit suicide. You are to beat the enemy." A pale spring moon shone between the clouds, lending an appearance of statues to my motionless, silent audience. The almost visible tension mounted until it was broken by an officer in the front row who said, "Captain Hara, may I ask a question?" I nodded assent to Lieutenant Kenji Hata, who continued, "During my 4 years at the academy, we were taught to live and die with our ship, which suggests that we should not abandon our ship under any circumstance. May I ask for clarification of your remarks, which seem confusing in this regard?" It was clear that Hata's confusion was shared by many of his shipmates, so I replied, "That is a very good question. I will try to answer it. If our ship is stricken, you are to abandon her immediately, without any qualms. This may seem contrary to what you have been taught in the past, but I will explain. We have reached a point of great adversity in this war. The material strength of the enemy is tremendous, but more crucial is our lack of skilled personnel because of our many losses in battle. It takes 5 years to train an officer, so they cannot be replaced quickly. This ship may sink, but there will be many more. Many fine Japanese sailors have died because they were too willing to give up their lives. If we are to win this war, we must be tenacious. In feudal times, lives were wasted cheaply, but we are in the 20th century. The code of Bushido, the way of the samurai, says that a warrior lives in such a way that he is always prepared to die. Nothing has been so abused and misinterpreted as this adage. It does not mean that a warrior must commit suicide for some slight reason. It means that we live so that we shall have no regrets when we must die. Death may come to a man at any moment, no matter how he lives. We must not forfeit our lives meaninglessly. Bushido does call for atonement by suicide in case of gross negligence, and we can commit suicide at any time. But we are going on this mission not to commit suicide, but to win, and turn the tide of war. We are to win this war and not think of dying. Does that answer your question, Hata? Yes, sir, it does, he shouted. And I share your views entirely. Thank you very much. And he saluted. I shouted, Let us all do our best and turn the tide of war. This curious briefing was broken up by the tumultuous shouting of the entire crew as they joined me in 3 cheers for the Emperor and Yahagi. On our way, a final assault exercise was conducted. Yamato was the hypothetical enemy, and each of her escorts made a firing run against her. We simulated the runs we would make against enemy targets next day. It was my first chance to run Yahagi at her maximum speed of 35 knots, but the time allowed us was short and we had to resume column formation for our southward passage. Our radios soon picked up nearby transmissions from an enemy submarine. Yamato ordered a column right turn to close Kyushu for the protection of its eastern coast. Moonset left the ocean in pitch darkness as the weather turned bad. Lookouts strained their eyes but could see nothing. Everyone was tense, but there was no submarine attack. Unknown to me, my old destroyer Amatsukaze was that day blasted into the East China Sea by American bombers, as if in prelude to the greater catastrophe that was about to befall the fleet of which I was a part. But even had I known of Amatsukaze's misfortune, the news would have had no portent for me. As I had told my crew, my thoughts were all on the success of our operation. There was no room for defeat. Our fleet advanced in column formation, zigzagging at 10 knots, and skirted the southeastern coast of Kyushu. At 700 on the morning of April 7th, we turned again to 210 degrees, as if heading for Sasebo at the northwestern end of Kyushu. While making this feint, the 10 ships shifted slowly into a ring formation around Yamato on a 2,000-meter radius. Yahagi took position directly ahead of Yamato. Counting clockwise, the 8 destroyers formed the rest of the circle as follows: Asashimo at 7:12 minutes, Kasumi at 15, Fuyutsuki 21, Hatsushima 27, Yukikaze 33, Suzutsuki 39, Hamakaze 45, and Isokaze 52-12. As soon as the ring was formed, the ships boosted speed to 24 knots and resumed their zigzag advance. The first zig of 45 degrees to the right placed Asashimo in lead position. The ensuing zag of 90 degrees brought Isokaze to the front. This formation movement requires the utmost in precision manoeuvring. It provides good protection against attack by submarines, limited as they are in mobility for attack. But the zigzag ring formation is relatively ineffective against attack by swift planes, which can rapidly shift to any attack angle. The ring formation and zigzag pattern for the Special Attack Force had been decided upon at Ito's conference as soon as the orders had been accepted. It would soon prove to be a poor decision. The beautiful weather of our departure day changed completely overnight. It was unseasonably cool. Leaden clouds covered the sky and hung low on the sea. Not a beam of sunshine pierced the thick cloud layers. Rain could come at any moment. It was a dismal day. The coast of Kyushu disappeared quickly when we turned southward into the East China Sea. An uneasy feeling came over me for the first time since our departure, when I considered that this was the worst possible weather for a surface sortie. Daylight visibility of only 20,000 meters offered a distinct advantage to the enemy with his excellent radar. A blinding rainstorm would work to our advantage, but I knew that we could not expect it in this latitude. I wondered why we could not have chosen more advantageous weather for our desperate mission. Lookouts posted on Yahagi's decks gleefully announced the appearance of 20 Zero fighters from the north. They flew low past us and circled to come over again, darting in and out of the low cloud banks. Uchino asked if they had come to fly cover for our force. "No, Uchino, they are not for us," Kimura replied calmly. "We will have no air cover. They are on a routine training flight. Kusaka probably told these young pilots to fly over and bid us farewell." Glum silence prevailed on the bridge until Yamato signalled that she was catapulting one of her 2 remaining planes to go to nearby Ibusuki Air Base, and ordered Yahagi to send off one of hers. Yamato normally carried 7 planes, but 5 had been offloaded at Kure. The 6th was being released now, as well as one from Yahagi, because Admiral Ito did not want them to be wasted on our sure-death sortie. One of Yahagi's pilots reported to me just before taking off. He stood at stiff attention and said, "Under orders, I am now going to Ibusuki, but there I shall join a kamikaze mission and be seeing you soon again." When his plane was catapulted, he circled 3 times over our ship and then headed back toward Kyushu. Men on deck waved him a last farewell. The next message from Yamato was that her last plane and the last one from Yahagi should now be launched to return to Kyushu. But this order was rescinded shortly when 2 unidentified planes were sighted to the north. Our ship-based scout planes would have no chance against enemy fighters. Uchino grumbled. Why didn't those Zero fighters hang around to fight enemy planes? Kimura answered him calmly. Take it easy, Uchino. Hold your temper. You know those youngsters wouldn't have a chance against the seasoned enemy pilots. The clouds lowered, the weather grew worse, and at 800 it started to drizzle. Our ring formation of 10 ships advanced steadily toward their doom, observed constantly by enemy scout planes. At the same time, Japanese planes calmly winged their way on a training mission. I had seen many kinds of operations, but never one like this. It was weird. At 0900, destroyer Asashimo, right of Yahagi, slowed down. Through binoculars, I could almost make out the face of my old friend Sugihara on her bridge, where there was a flurry of excitement. Her signal flags announced engine trouble. Greatly disturbed to see her fall behind, leaving a breach in the ring formation, I sent a message requesting further information. Asashimo replied, "Rushing repairs. Hope to rejoin soon." But she fell farther behind, and by 1000 hours was completely out of sight. Kimura ordered Kasumi to move up into the vacancy, and the next 4 destroyers shifted their positions accordingly. This adjustment was no mean feat, while the formation continued its zigzag course. It had meant a lot to me to know that my old friend Sugihara was supporting my right flank. It was dismaying to realize that this place was now occupied by the second smallest ship of our force. Our radios presently began to pick up enemy messages again, this time transmitted from aircraft near at hand. It was clear that our feint course had served no purpose. The enemy was aware of our force. A pleasanter matter was the appearance of 3 2,000-ton freighters to port. They presented a cheery aspect as they saluted us. Someone remarked that he didn't realize we still had transports of this size. At 11:30, a seaplane was detected 20,000 meters to the east. It approached to within a safe distance and circled leisurely about our formation, giving detailed reports of our movements. What a pity we did not have fighters available to shoot down this threat to our safety. While we watched wistfully, this plane cruised beyond the range of our anti-aircraft guns. The radio suddenly boomed. Amami Oshima Lookout Station reports 250 enemy planes heading northward. Here they come, said Kimura with a wry smile. Amami Oshima is an island midway between Kyushu and Okinawa. Without even looking at a chart, every bridge officer knew that these enemy planes would be overhead within an hour. Yamato ordered distance between ships increased to 5,000 meters, a standard procedure against air attack. Yahagi and the 7 destroyers poured on fuel, and gun crews readied their weapons. Yahagi's 6 big 150 meters, guns 4 80 meters, anti-aircraft guns, and 40 machine guns pointed rapidly skyward. Ammunition supplies at hand, the gunners stood alert at their positions. When noon came and there was no sign of an attack, orderlies brought lunch to the combat posts. Everyone ate hurriedly, washing down the food with steaming green tea. I watched the efficient preparations with great satisfaction. My uneasiness vanished, and I knew that Yahagi would give a good account of herself. At 12:20, Yamato signalled her radar findings. Large group of planes distant 30,000 meters, bearing 35 degrees to port. All ships, full speed ahead, prepare for anti-aircraft action. The orders were hardly necessary. All ships were making nearly 30 knots. With Kimura and other officers, I climbed to Yahagi's anti-aircraft command post behind the bridge. Yamato raised huge bow waves as she pushed through the water at her maximum speed. The 72,000-ton battleship presented a striking inspiration to every man in the force. Navy men had an almost religious faith in Yamato. This feeling was heightened when she returned intact from the Leyte battle, even though sister ship Musashi was sunk there. Rear Admiral Nobue Morishita was on board as Ito's chief of staff. He had been in command of Yamato at Leyte and, I thought, would surely bring her good luck again. Who could imagine that this greatest battleship ever built would be sunk within 2 hours? Even from the command post, we still could not see any planes approaching. The cloud cover had descended to 1,500 meters, and a sudden rain squall blurred out everything around us. The situation couldn't have been worse, and now the planes must be overhead, above the clouds. Though Yahagi had practiced firing control with her new radar, it worked only against surface targets. Her sets were useless against planes. I realized woefully that our manually operated guns would not even have time to aim once enemy planes popped out of the low clouds. A lookout shouted, "2 planes on part bow." I looked up to see not 2 but 20, 40, and more planes spilling out of the thick clouds. It was 12:32 when I ordered, "Open fire." I had expected the planes to swoop down at us immediately. Instead, they began circling clockwise, just below the clouds. Then I saw that one of the 3 groups was circling counterclockwise. This strange activity was completely baffling. Gun crews fumbled trying to set ranges, and then they seemed too bewildered to fire. The confident enemy was methodically sizing up his victims. While they circled, the flight commanders must have been assigning planes to specific targets. There was brief sporadic fire from a few of our ships when all the planes first came into view and started their merry-go-round. Yamato's 9 18.1-inch guns roared off a few rounds of Type 3 shells which scattered in the sky, but even these fell miserably short of the intended goals. Suddenly the planes whirled and came thundering down toward their selected targets. Many ships' guns were still swinging into position. The first planes to pick on Yahagi were 4 Avenger TBM bombers. Our cruiser rattled and roared, firing with all guns, but with little aim, as the bombs came curving down toward our port side. I called for hard right rudder, and Yahagi responded beautifully. The bombs, dropped from about 500 meters, raised water pillars all about, but none hit. The next group, Hellcat, F-6F fighters, dove defiantly lower. I could see the face of one pilot who jerked his stubby plane upward scarcely 10 meters in front of me. The deadly whine and thud of machine gun bullets beat like hail through the length of the ship, but none hit my men. The gun crews stuck to their posts and fired steadily, but they also failed to score. I looked hastily about to see all ships dashing at full speed, kicking up white waves and shooting with everything they had. In the water I caught sight of the weird crossing of foamy lines which spelled aerial torpedoes. "Right rudder, full speed!" I shouted as another dozen planes came at us. Black bombs sent white spray towering 100 meters into the air. Fighters came careering down, fanning us with bullets and prop wash as they pulled out at masthead level. Yahagi's guns returned a curtain of steel. Still neither side scored. A lookout shrieked, "More bombers coming!" "Hard right rudder," I thundered, and the 8,500-ton ship jerked and wheeled in response, staggering a moment in her violent turn. Our guns missed again, but so did the enemy planes. Yahagi's 4th group of attackers was coming in when the radio room reported that a Sashimo was under attack. No time to think of that lone crippled ship as I streamed out orders to keep us from being hit. We wove through that rain of bombs and bullets, again without getting hurt. But what about a Sashimo? With her engine trouble, Sugihara would have little chance to oppose an attack. It was fantastic that the enemy could be striking our main force so heavily and still have planes free to spring on a straggler more than 20 miles away. Yamato was ploughing ahead at full speed. Destroyers were corkscrewing violently here and there, appearing and vanishing in tremendous waves punctuated by mushrooming bursts from bomb hits, misses, and near misses. The spectacle was at once thrilling and terrifying. More planes swinging low over Yahagi brought me sharply to action as near misses jolted the ship, but we were still uninjured. It gave me a feeling of relief to realize that our sharp twists and turns were effective in dodging the enemy's attack. If that was an unguarded moment, it was my undoing. A scream from portside, "Torpedoes!" I shouted helm orders, looked down, and in the same moment let out a gasp. 3 torpedo wakes were streaking toward us from only a few hundred yards away. The launching Avengers whizzed past the deck, zoomed and thundered triumphantly away. This time I did not follow the planes, but looked steadily at the eerie lines of approaching foam. Yahagi again staggered for a moment in the midst of her violent turn, then shuddered as a torpedo caught her portside, amidship just below the waterline. It is hard for me to believe to this day the occurrence of the next event. Yahagi stumbled crazily for a few minutes and then shuddered to an abrupt and horrifying halt. It was inconceivable that a speeding warship of her size could be brought so suddenly dead in the water by just one torpedo. My stupefaction was increased, if possible, when I looked unbelievingly at my watch to find that it was 12:46 hours. We had been fighting for only 12 minutes. I grabbed the engine room voice tube and called for a damage report. No response. I tried the phone with the same result. Then came the realization that the torpedo had hit the engine room, and I groaned. But the enemy allowed no time for lament. Another 6 planes swooped down to release bombs. I saw one hit and explode on the forecastle, felling at least a dozen men and blowing 6 bodies into the air. A detonation astern rocked Yahagi and caused a violent tremor throughout her length. Biting my lip in agony, I saw again the sinking Tokyo Maru, victim of a single torpedo hit in the engine room. In the same instant I thought of Britain's mighty Repulse and Prince of Wales sunk by a force far smaller than the one that now confronted us. Suddenly my bolstered confidence was shattered. An orderly came panting to the command post and reported, "The torpedo exploded in the centre of the engine room, killing everyone there. The compartments are flooding." "What about the watertight bulkheads?" "The damage control crews are working, sir." The ship was listing noticeably to starboard. I heard Komura say, "Hamikaze's done for." Looking to port where Komura was staring, I caught sight of the ship's red-painted belly as it sank beneath the waves. A new attack came before our wounded had even received first aid. Uchino ran down the ladder shouting orders to the gun crews. That was the last I ever saw of my worthy exec. All operable guns opened fire, and for the first time in this action, I saw Yahagi strike back effectively as 2 planes were knocked down. The ship itself, dead in the water, absorbed many bullets and bombs as group after group of enemy planes came driving in. A dozen to starboard winged low directly into the gunfire barrage. The enemy pilots certainly had guts. The stalled cruiser rocked violently again with a tremendous explosion in the stern. I looked back and saw 3 mangled bodies hurled 60 feet in the air, and another torpedo exploded in the starboard bow. Yahagi quivered and rocked as though made of paper. Clinging to the rail of the trembling command post, I saw that the torpedo hit had blasted a huge hole in the bow, and the ship's list was increasing. Still another group of fighters and bombers came to concentrate on that shattered bow. The deafening drum of machine gun bullets was climaxed by a direct bomb hit on No. 1 turret, which wiped out its entire crew and smashed men on the forecastle. Strangely, no one on the bridge or in the command post was hit, but rivets popped as steel plates worked loose and the bridge shook so violently that it might collapse at any moment. The structure of No. 1 turret was still intact, but the force of the 250-pound bomb explosion had cracked the thick steel of the surrounding deck. Yellow, acrid smoke drifted slowly up through the cleavages. Amid all that devastation, I was surprised to hear the voice of the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Hatter, shouting from his post to open the watercocks in No. 1 magazine. For a wonder the valves still worked, and the inrushing water quenched the fires in that magazine as Hatter had figured. With fires out, the yellow smoke stopped. Had that magazine exploded, the ship would have sunk quickly with no chance of survivors. But of course, the flooding magazine accelerated the listing of the ship. Still, the planes kept attacking, and the next group hit with more bombs than I was able to count. When the explosions ended, I shuddered to find that several gun posts and crews had vanished. How long can one endure the horror of his men being torn to shreds? And still there were no hits on the main bridge and command post. I was jolted back to my duties when the torpedo room voice tube squawked my name. It was Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Kamiyama requesting permission to empty the torpedo tubes. He said, "If they are set off, it will blast everything." "Okay, dump the fish," I shouted. Almost at once, 16 powerful homing torpedoes slithered unarmed into the water. I thought wistfully of what damage might have been done to enemy ships by these deadly weapons we now had to waste. It was another last-minute reminder of our doom. Kamiyama acted not a moment too soon. The last torpedo was barely in the water when bombs blasted the tubes and rooted out Yahagi's stern mast. Looking aft from the command post, still miraculously intact, I saw that the catapult was a shambles. The ruins of twisted iron looked like melting candy bars. The lone airplane, untouched just a minute ago, was a mass of cinders. A few guns barked as their burned and blood-soaked crews still manned their posts. Avengers came in skimming over the waves and dropped torpedoes. 3, 4, I could not tell how many found their target. Our dying ship quaked with the detonations. The explosions finally stopped, but the list continued as waves washed blood pools from the deck and dismembered bodies fell rolling into the sea. And now the second wave of some 100 planes had done their work and gone. I looked around. All gunposts lay in ruins. My proud cruiser was but a mass of junk, barely afloat. Strangely, I thought, there are no fires. Through this weird sight my dazed brain raced back to see cruiser San Francisco, the phantom-like ship my Amatsukaze almost crashed into that pitch-dark night off Santa Cruz. Now Yahagi, too, was a phantom ship. Nothing stirred on her main deck. Many of her crew had perished. On the bridge not a man had even been injured. "Hara," said Admiral Kimura, "I guess we better get out of here. It looks like now or never. The 250 planes reported by Amami Oshima seem to have done their job." There was nothing for me to say. I bowed and mumbled, "I'm very sorry, Admiral. Let us shift my flag to one of the destroyers and force through to our goal at Okinawa. What do you think?" What could I say? I was limp with the burden of responsibility at having lost my ship and crew. "Look, Hara, Isokaze is still operating." It was astonishing to find her to port in her original position of the ring formation, about 3,000 yards away. She appeared in good shape and was coming in our direction. It was one of the few heartening moments of the action. "All right, Admiral, let's abandon ship. Signalmen, raise Isokaze, urgent." At my command, the powerful signal light began blinking, and a signalman also went to work with a pair of hand flags. Word went through Yahagi to prepare to abandon ship, and survivors were made ready for evacuation. Isokaze responded to our signal and kicked up high waves as she raced to the shattered hulk of our cruiser Yahagi. The destroyer slowed down 1,000 meters away for a cautious approach and drew slowly closer. I ordered, "Abandon ship." "Enemy planes!" a lookout cried, and 1 minute later the third wave of fighters and bombers was overhead. Isokaze had approached to within about 200 yards. Scores of planes broke off from attacking Yamato to head for the hapless, slow-moving destroyer. Her engines roared into full power as she frantically took evasive measures, but the planes were everywhere, spewing their torrents of bullets and bombs. Explosion followed explosion until Isokaze disappeared in a billow of black smoke. Yahagi had doomed her own destroyer. It was what had almost happened to my Shigure when Sendai was under murderous attack at Empress Augusta Bay, but I had refused to take Shigure into that slaughter. Now I hoped that Isokaze would ignore my request and escape. When it appeared that the destroyer was done for, the planes came to work over what was left of Yahagi. Our floating junk pile was raked and combed by machine gun bullets. Yahagi twisted, rivets popped, plates buckled, and I clung to the bridge rail in desperation. As Yahagi's convulsions subsided, I raised my head and was surprised to see Isokaze emerge from the dissipating wall of smoke and water which had surrounded her. Injured, but still alive, she was speeding frantically away. Again, scores of planes swooped over Isokaze, which was again lost in a cloud of smoke. After swinging past Isokaze, each plane felt obliged to pay its aggressive respects to our sinking ship. We could do nothing but hang on. The missiles of the enemy were no more frightening than the trembling of our ship in its final throes. Lieutenant J.G. Yukio Matsuda, a navigation officer, had rounded up a dozen wounded men and was trying to get them into a lifeboat. This activity drew the attention of 3 more fighters who concentrated their fire, smashing the boat to bits and dropping the unlucky 13 dead in pools of their own blood. Elsewhere, men were jumping from the ship into the water. The enemy allowed no time for breath. A 4th wave of about 100 planes arrived to pound and batter everything that still moved. Komura, a few other officers, and I remained unscathed in the command post, which still stood miraculously intact on the crumbling debris of what had been light cruiser Yahagi. Looking out to sea, I knew that Isokaze was in trouble. Her speed had fallen off, and, though not on fire, she staggered like a drunk. Suzutsuki, farther off, was afire and pouring out billows of thick black smoke. Kasumi limped helplessly out of control, her flag signalling rudder trouble. Yamato still appeared to be in good shape. At a distance of 3 miles, I had no way of knowing that this pride of the Navy was as badly off as Yahagi. Destroyers Yukikaze and Fuyutsuki flitted nimbly about in a valiant effort to protect the huge ship. The 5th wave, of more than 100 planes, showed no mercy to Yahagi in her final agonies. Bullets hissed and whined all about me. Not caring now, completely dazed, I gritted my teeth and mumbled, "All right, you Yankee devils, finish us off." The whine of a bullet and a sudden sting made me think I was done for, but in knocking me down it roused me from a daze. I examined and dismissed as negligible a wound on my left arm, and then noticed that waves were lapping the deck of the command post where Admiral Komura and I now stood alone. "Well, Hara, shall we go?" he asked calmly. "Let's go." While we were removing our shoes, I noted the time, 14:06. Planes roared overhead. Waves were up to our knees when we jumped into the water. I swam only a few meters when some gigantic invisible force dragged me under. I resisted and struggled, but the sucking whirlpool of a sinking ship is irresistible. I gave up and passed out, accepting death. My next awareness was of being released from a vice-like hold. I was kicking and writhing. Around me was complete darkness, but it was thinning. Fuzzily, I admired a mass of bluish beads as they drifted up in front of my face. These were bubbles of air from my clothing and my lungs. Pain of suffocation forced me to swallow a huge gulp of seawater, and then my head broke the surface. I breathed deeply again and again in a great void in which there was no sound, no light, no feeling, no anything. Dazed, not knowing what I was doing, I managed to stay afloat. Gradually, my eyes began to focus, and I was aware of daylight. A buzzing sound turned into voices, and looking around, I saw heads floating on the water. They were all black. In my stupor, I felt it must be a Negro bathing beach where I was enjoying a pleasant swim. My brain revived, but slowly. I was still dazed. The fatigue and tension of 2 hours of battle, followed by tremendous shock and collapse, were too much. Then I heard someone shout, "Hara! Are you all right? Hara! Do you hear me?" I peered in the direction of the voice, saw a black-faced man shouting at me, and recognized Admiral Komura. His wind and sun-tanned face was so dark that he was recognizable at a distance of 30 feet, even though heavily covered with black oil. "I'm all right, Komura," I answered. "How about you?" "Yes, I'm quite all right." So the Negroes around me were my own men. I patted my face and found my palm covered with heavy oil. The surface of the water was covered with this oil from Yahagi. To my surprise, there were many men clinging to bits and pieces of wood. I thought that the crew had all perished. As my vision returned, I caught a glimpse of Yamato, still big and impressive even at a distance of 6 miles. Rolling waves occasionally hid her, but when a crest raised me high, I could see scores of planes swarming about her like gnats. While I floated, wondering what would happen, a log drifted by within my grasp. I clutched at it, grabbed and clung to it tenaciously. With my security thus improved, I considered what my next move should be. "Hey you! Move over! Make room for me!" shouted someone behind me. A young man was trying to reach the log. I moved slowly to one end to permit him a handhold. He caught the log and looked at me gratefully. "Who are you? What's your name?" he asked as soon as he caught his breath. "My name is Hara. I'm from Yahagi." My new neighbour gasped and was suddenly speechless. He stared at me for some moments as though in a trance. "I'm very sorry, sir," he mumbled. "Forgive my rudeness. I am second-class Seaman Daiwa. I'd better find another log, Captain Hara. This one isn't big enough to support both of us." He looked around uneasily, and I said, "Don't be foolish, son. Hang on tight. We can manage. Are you hurt?" "No, sir, not at all. My friend Asamo and I decided to die quickly when Yahagi was doomed. We went to No. 3 magazine and mounted the shells, waiting to be blown to bits. But Petty Officer Yamada came and ordered us up on deck. He said, 'This is my place.' He was so furious that we raced up the ladder. I stumbled once and sprained my ankle, but that is nothing. I wonder what happened to Hanada and my buddy Asamo. Don't worry, Daiwa. Now think only of survival. You will get out of this if you don't give up." We looked around and saw Yamato, still moving. What a beautiful sight. Suddenly, smoke belched from her waterline. We both groaned as white smoke billowed out until it covered the great battleship, giving her the appearance of a snow-capped Mount Fuji. Next came black smoke mingled with the white, forming into a huge cloud which climbed to 2,000 meters. As it drifted away, we looked to the surface of the sea again, and there was nothing. Yamato had vanished. Tremendous detonations at 14:23 of that 7th day of April signalled the end of this unsinkable symbol of the Imperial Navy. I felt a sudden chill and realized for the first time that it was raining. As I thought of Yamato, my tears mingled with the rain and the water of the sea. After the war, my friend Rear Admiral Nobue Morishita, one of Yamata's 269 survivors, told me the details of her last minutes. The fast direct hit on Yamato was by bombs at 12:40, and the first torpedo struck the ship to port 10 minutes later. In all, 8 more torpedoes hit on the port side and 2 hit to starboard. Captain Jiro Nomura, Yamato's exec, determined at 14:05 that the ship's trim could not be restored. Thereupon Vice Admiral Ito, who had been on the bridge throughout the battle, cancelled the operation and ordered "abandon ship." Destroyer Fuyutsuki was called in to assist the evacuation, but it was impossible to approach the rapidly sinking behemoth. Commander Hidechika Sakuma, skipper of Fuyutsuki, kept clear because he figured that his small ship would be dragged down as the big ones sank. Ito shook hands with the officers on the bridge and then withdrew to his cabin to die with the ship. Yamato's skipper, Rear Admiral Kosaku Aruga, tied himself to the bridge binnacle to ensure going down with Yamato. Morishita had to argue violently with the other officers who wanted to share the fate of Ito, Aruga, and Yamato, but he convinced them and they all left the bridge together. The ship's port list was increasing rapidly when the last torpedo hit at 14:17. 3 minutes later, the list had reached 20 degrees, inducing explosions which sent the ship into a precipitous plunge. These same explosions saved Morishita and others, throwing them clear of the ship. Clinging to the log, I was lost in gloomy thoughts for several minutes after Yamato's sinking. I grieved at the loss of my cruiser, and I grieved doubly at the loss of the world's greatest battleship. Looking about, I could see no sign of Komura, and young Daiwa was no longer clinging to the other end of the log. There was no one in sight. I seemed to be riding a current which had carried me away from the others. Was I to die like this, alone? Then I heard voices singing, not too far away. I thought of our survival instruction that men adrift in the ocean should stay quiet to conserve physical strength and not exhaust themselves with singing and shouting. Since these men were singing, they had probably decided that there was no chance of rescue, and they might just as well give their spirits whatever lift might be derived from song. The sound grew stronger as more voices joined. I heard it distinctly and recognized the song of the warrior, familiar to Japanese fighting men for hundreds of years. If I go to sea, I shall return a corpse awash. If duty calls me to the mountain, a verdant sword will be my pall. Thus, for the sake of the Emperor, I shall not die peacefully at home. As the song was repeated, I found myself joining in. From time to time there were hoarse shouts of "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor, which suggested that the exhausted or seriously wounded singers were dropping out of the chorus to their death. I closed my eyes and the song grew faint in my ears. I knew that I was going to die. The distant melody, wavering like a lullaby, brought back my childhood and my mother's songs, my grandfather, school days, the academy, our world cruise, shopping in a New York department store, young officer days, my affair with the geisha girl. This kaleidoscope changed into a vivid picture of my mother, overlapped by one of my wife, and then my last formal officer portrait, which was replaced by the faces of my children. I came out of this weird reverie with tears streaming down my cheeks. Thinking of my last home leave, just 4 months ago, and the children and my wife, I realized that they would face many hardships after my death. I cried aloud for their forgiveness and hoped they would try to understand. It was selfish of me to have married Chizu, taking her away from the comfortable life she had known. Now I was leaving her widowed, with 3 children. Forgive me, Chizu. The singing had stopped. The water and the air seemed colder. I shuddered, chilled to the bone. My hands were going numb and I was having trouble keeping my grip. Something drifted by and I picked it up. Nothing but a piece of black paper. I started to throw it away, but instead shoved it in my raincoat pocket. Then I felt something else and pulled it out. It was a 4-foot piece of rope. I had no idea of how it got there, but this rope changed my entire outlook. I tied myself so that even if I passed out, the log would still keep me afloat. And there was always the chance that my body would wash ashore on the coast of Japan. Planes were overhead again, probably the last attack wave, but in my increasing torpor they were a matter of indifference, until several fighters began to spray the sea with machine gun bullets. They concentrated on the large group of survivors, still separated from me, but some bullets came my way too. None hit me, but the whine and swish of bullets awakened me to anger against the pilots. Hating them, I found unrealized strength which let me duck and twist around, and my numbness soon vanished. No more fighters came, but to my astonishment, a Martin, PBM flying boat, swooped low and landed on the water about 300 meters away. I ducked again, but the Martin paid no attention to me. It taxied slowly to a patch of water dyed brilliantly green, picked up an American pilot who had been drifting in a life raft and took off again. I watched that operation with feelings of envy. The feelings of another Yahagi survivor, Ensign Shigeo Yamada, who was also close to the rescue, were quite different. He was born in Hawaii and, being proficient in English, served as a communication officer. He later told me, "I was afraid of being taken prisoner because of my background and hastily tore all insignia of rank from my uniform and threw them away, but the flying boat and her crew did not come near me." Yamada survived the war and in 1958 was working in the Japan Airlines offices in Chicago, Illinois, a prospect not readily envisaged that April day of 1945. The area was all quiet again. I felt easy for the first time and began to reflect coolly on the day's actions. My anti-aircraft manoeuvring had been clumsy. In a destroyer I would have pulled through without any doubt. So my true caliber was that of a destroyer skipper, nothing more. But that was wrong. I blundered in forgetting the solution used successfully off Kavieng when Shigure had bagged the 2 bombers. Yahagi was much faster and more agile than Shigure. Why had I kept the cruiser in the outmoded zigzag pattern which let the torpedo catch us? Yes, I had blundered, but I was rusty after a year ashore. If only the High Command had kept me at sea instead of diverting me to that useless and ineffective shore assignment. All our practice and training, with homing torpedoes, proximity fuses, and radar-controlled gunfire, had been of no use in this day's action against hundreds of planes. Everything we did seemed to be wrong. This very operation itself, without aerial protection of any kind for the ships, was a grotesque mistake. I had no idea of how many hours had passed since Yahagi's sinking. It was dark and the wind was rising. I shuddered with cold and began to get drowsy. I fought against sleep, knowing that with sleep would come an end to my cares. But after all, a samurai lives so that he is always prepared to die. I could wait quietly for death, without regret or remorse. Around me I saw nothing but rising waves, and heard nothing but the sound of the water slapping against my log. I closed my eyes and slept, with my head resting against the wood. I dreamed of days gone by. I was crossing from Shikoku to Honshu for the first time, to apply for the academy entrance exams. The engine of the ferryboat had a distinctive sound, and I could hear it clearly again. It did not seem like a dream. I opened my eyes, and the sound continued. I saw a destroyer a mile away and thought it must still be fighting off the persistent planes. My head sank down again on the log, but the engine noise kept me from dozing. It sounded too close to be the destroyer. I looked up and saw a motorboat. This small craft, the kind normally carried by a destroyer, was not more than 200 meters away, and readily visible between wave crests. I wondered what it was doing here. The boat disappeared. I craned my neck for another sight of it. After some minutes it emerged again, this time only 50 meters away. The boat was circling, looking for survivors. Suddenly I was terrified. I wanted desperately to live and was afraid they might miss me. I yelled at the top of my lungs, but the boat completed its circle without noticing me. In desperation, I untied myself from the log and thrashed the water with my arms and legs. That did it. They noticed the splashing and turned in my direction. It seemed an eternity before they reached me. I was too weak even to grab the side of the boat, but 4 strong hands quickly hauled me in. It was curious, but as soon as my feet were in the dry boat, my exhaustion vanished. I stammered gratitude to my rescuers, and was surprised to see that there were no other survivors in the boat. The crew chief explained that they had already brought many survivors to the destroyer, and this was their last trip. They searched for another 15 minutes without further success and headed back to destroyer Hatsushimo. My surge of energy gave out when I tried to climb the ladder. My feet simply would not move. 2 husky sailors boosted me to the destroyer deck. Hatsushimo's skipper, Commander Masazo Sako, greeted me. "Welcome home, Captain Hara. We had almost despaired of finding you. Admiral Komura is resting in my cabin." I mumbled my thanks to Sako, and was grateful that darkness hid my face, which must have reflected how badly I felt. Sako took me to the sick bay where my water and oil-soaked clothes were removed. Skilled corpsmen gave me first aid and a massage, which did much to restore me. I thanked them and asked for a glass of sake. The doctor laughed and said, "Yes, Captain Hara. Ordinarily I might object, but I am sure that sake is just what you need." The drink revived me quickly, and they next gave me a steaming bowl of soup. While I drank, the medical officer briefed me on events as seen from his ship. I'm afraid that Hatsushimo did not contribute much to this mission. The attackers passed us by to strike at Yamato. As a result, we did not suffer a direct hit of any kind. 2 of our sailors were slightly injured, but not a man on board was killed. Hatsushimo is probably the only undamaged ship of our force. That's why we stayed here looking for survivors. Fuyutsuki, Suzutsuki, and Yukikaze, all damaged, left for Sasebo 2 hours ago. Fuyutsuki is not in bad shape. She was hit by 2 rockets, neither of which exploded, but a dozen of her men were killed by machine gun bullets. Yukikaze is not badly damaged, but she lost 3 men killed by strafing. Suzutsuki was hit by a bomb which knocked off her bows, and she had to return stern first to Sasebo. Isokaze was not so lucky. She suffered no direct hits, but near misses holed her, flooding the engine room and killing 100 of her crew. When there was no hope for her, she was dispatched by Yukikaze, who took survivors. Kasumi was badly disabled and had 17 killed. Her survivors were removed by Fuyutsuki, who then gave her the coup de grace. I thanked him for the information and had nothing else to ask except, "Did you rescue a sailor named Daiwa?" The medic checked a list and replied, "Yes, sir. His name is here. In fact, he has been asking about you ever since he was picked up 2 hours ago." He called an orderly. "Tell Daiwa that Captain Hara is safe." Destroyer Hatsushimo, loaded with hundreds of Yamato and Yahagi survivors, returned to Sasebo at noon on the 8th of April. An orderly knocked at the captain's cabin as soon as we had anchored and delivered a message to Admiral Komura. He read it, grimaced, and handed it to me. It was a citation for the Second Fleet from Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, commending our force for its gallant self-sacrifice which enabled the special attack planes to achieve a Great War result. What was this Great War result? The air attack effort that day consisted of 114 planes. The 60 fighters, 40 bombers, and 14 kamikazes succeeded only in damaging carrier Hancock, battleship Maryland, and destroyer Bennett at a cost of nearly 100 planes. The Second Fleet had sorted with 1 battleship, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. It was attacked over a period of 2 hours by a total of 386 carrier-based planes. 10 of these planes and 12 American lives were lost to anti-aircraft fire from our ships. Of the Second Fleet, only 3 destroyers survived. Japanese lives lost in the action came to 2,498 in Yamato, 446 in Yahagi, and 721 in the destroyers. These simple but astounding statistics tell the story of who won and who lost the last aerial surface engagement of the war. The powerful navy which had launched the Pacific War 40 months before with the attack on Pearl Harbor had at last been struck down. On April 7, 1945, with the sinking of battleship Yamato, the Imperial Japanese Navy died. This attack was by USS Redfin, Sea Dr. Robert D. King, on her first war patrol. 4 torpedoes were fired, and King claimed 4 hits and a sinking. They flew in 2 flying boats which met storms over the Philippines. The second plane, carrying V-ADM, Shigeru Fukudome, skirted the typhoon, which apparently accounted for Koga's plane, and made a forced landing near Cebu Island. Koga's death was not publicly announced until May 5th, when Admiral Soemu Toyoda was announced as his successor. V. ADM. Shiro Takasu, Southwest Area Fleet Commander, had interim command of the combined fleet. Nagumo took his own life on July 6th with a pistol shot. About 6,000 of these small motorboats were built by dozens of manufacturers. The craft varied in length from 16 to 18 feet, and in weight from 1.35 to 2.15 tons. Most of them were powered by a single automobile engine and could make up to 26 knots. Others, having 2 engines, could do 28 knots. A few were made of steel, but most were wooden, and fragile to a degree that belied their imposing name. Shigure was sunk by submarine Blackfin, Crediol W.L. Kitch, in position 06°00N, 103°48E, sunk or killed in the ensuing action, by submarine Sturgeon, Lieutenant C.L. Murphy, Jr. All U.S. planes in this day's action were from the carriers of Task Force 58, Avenger pilot Latente J.G. W.E. Delaney, USNR, from CFL Belleau Wood, was thus rescued by a PBM piloted by Lieutenant James R. Young, USNR. In anticipation of a Japanese supply effort to Vila on the southwest corner of Kolombangara Island, 14 boats of MTB Flotilla 1 were on patrol in Blackett Strait on Sunday night, August 1, 1943. They had departed from their Rendova base at 1830 and arrived at stations 2 hours later. PT-109, Lieutenant J.G. Jack Kennedy, USNR, was patrolling Blackett Strait about 02:30 at idling using only one of her 3 engines, when a dark shape loomed up on her starboard bow at a distance of no more than 300 yards. At first this shape was taken for another PT boat, but it was soon identified as a Hibiki-type destroyer of the Fubuki class, and bearing down on PT-109 at high speed. The torpedo boat started a starboard turn preparatory to firing torpedoes, but had swung through no more than 30 degrees when the destroyer struck forward of the forward starboard torpedo tube and sheared off the starboard side of the boat aft, including the starboard engine. Scarcely 10 seconds elapsed between time of sighting and the crash. The destroyer neither slowed nor fired as she split the PT. A surface gasoline fire ignited immediately about 20 yards from the remains of the boat which were still afloat. Lieutenant Kennedy ordered abandon ship as it appeared that the fire was approaching. When this danger passed, they crawled back on board except for 3 men 100 yards to the southwest, 2 to the northeast, and 2 who did not respond to shouts and proved to be missing. Kennedy swam toward the group of Harris, McMahon, and Starkey, while ensigns Leonard J. Tom and George H. R. Ross struck out for Zinsser and Johnson. McMahon was helpless because of serious burns, and Kennedy had to tow him back to the boat, which took an hour because a strong current impeded their progress. Kennedy then returned for the other 2 men. He traded his life belt for Harris's useless waterlogged life jacket, and together they towed injured Starkey back to the PT. Meanwhile, Tom and Ross had reached Zinsser and Johnson, who were both helpless because of gasoline fumes, and towed them. Both men regained consciousness by the time they got to the boat. Within 3 hours after the crash, all survivors who could be located were on board PT-109. Marnie and Kirksey were never seen after the crash. During the 3 hours it took to gather survivors, nothing was seen or heard to indicate other ships in the area. No very pistols were fired for fear of giving away their position to the enemy. All classified gear and publications on board were sunk in the deep waters of Vella Gulf. When daylight of August 2nd arrived, the 11 survivors were still on board. It was estimated that the boat then lay about 4 miles north and slightly east of Gizo anchorage, and about 3 miles from the reef along the northeast side of Gizo Island. Despite the fact that all watertight doors were dogged down at the time of the crash, PT-109 was slowly taking on water. It was obvious that the boat would sink on the 2nd, so it was decided to abandon it in time to reach one of the tiny islands east of Gizo before dark. A small island 4 miles southeast of Gizo was chosen rather than a closer one, which it was feared might be occupied by Japanese. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Kennedy took the badly burned McMahon in tow and set out for land, intending to lead the way and scout the island in advance of the others. Ensigns Ross and Tom followed with the other men. Johnson and Mauer, who could not swim, were tied to a float rigged from a 2X8, which was part of the 37mm gun mount. Harris and Maguire were fair swimmers, but Zinsser, Starkey and Albert were not so good. The strong swimmers pushed or towed the float to which the non-swimmers were tied. The men had shed most of their clothes. Ensign Tom was the only one who still wore shoes. By way of arms, the group had 6 .45s, 2 of which were lost before their rescue, 1 .38, 1 large knife, 1 light knife, and a pocket knife. They had 1 flashlight, but the first aid kit was lost in the collision. All of the group, with the exception of McMahon, who suffered greatly from burns, were in fairly good condition, although weak and tired from their swim ashore. That evening, Lieutenant Kennedy decided to swim into Ferguson Passage in an attempt to intercept PT boats proceeding to their patrol areas. He left about 1830, swam to a small island 1–2 mile to the southeast, proceeded along a reef which stretched out into Ferguson Passage, arriving there about 2000. He saw no PTs, but did observe aircraft flares which indicated that the boats were operating that night in Gizo instead of Blackett Strait and being harassed as usual by enemy float planes. Kennedy began his return over the same route, but was caught in a current which swept him in a 2-mile circle into Blackett Strait and back to the middle of Ferguson Passage, where he had to start his homeward trip all over again. He stopped on the small island just southeast of home, where he slept until dawn before covering the last mile to join the rest of his group. On his return to the group, he was completely exhausted, slightly feverish, and slept most of the day. Nothing was seen on August 2nd or 3rd that gave any hope of rescue. On the night of the 3rd, Ensign Ross swam into Ferguson Passage in another attempt to intercept PT patrols from Rendover, without success. The total diet of the group, on what they called Bird Island, because of its abundance of droppings from the feathered creatures, consisted of coconuts as long as they lasted. When the supply ran low, and in order to get closer to Ferguson Passage, the group left Bird Island at noon of August 4th, and using the same arrangements as before, headed for an islet west of Cross Island. Kennedy, with McMahon in tow, arrived first. The rest of the group again experienced difficulty with a strong easterly current, but finally made the eastern tip of the island. Their new abode was slightly larger, offered brush for concealment and a few coconuts, and had no Japanese tenants. The night of August 4th was wet and cold, and no one ventured into Ferguson Passage. The next morning Kennedy and Ross swam to Cross Island in search of some help for the party. Before they left, a New Zealand P-40 was seen making a strafing run on that island, indicating the possible presence of the enemy. But so acute was their food shortage that the two men set out, swam the channel, and arrived on the island about 15:30. They sneaked through the brush to the east side of the island and surveyed the beach. They spied a small rectangular box with Japanese writing on the side and furtively pulled it into the bush. It contained several dozen bags of candy and crackers. A little farther up the beach they found a one-man canoe and a barrel of water alongside a native lean-to. At the same time they sighted 2 natives in a canoe, who, despite all efforts by Kennedy and Ross to attract their attention, paddled swiftly off to the northwest. Nevertheless, having obtained a canoe, food, and water, Kennedy and Ross considered their visit a success. That night, Kennedy took the canoe to venture again into Ferguson Passage. When no PTs had appeared by 2100, he returned home by way of Cross Island, where he picked up the food but left Ross, who had decided to swim back the following morning. When Kennedy returned about 2330, he found that the 2 natives he had sighted near Cross Island had circled around and landed on his home island. Ensign Tom finally convinced them that he and his colleagues were Americans, and they then landed and performed every possible service for the survivors. The natives were sent with messages to friendly coast watchers, informing that the crew of PT-109 was on Cross Island. After the natives left, Ross and Kennedy remained on the island until evening, when they set out in the 2-man canoe to again try their luck at intercepting PTs in Ferguson Passage. They paddled far, saw nothing, and were caught in a sudden rain squall which capsized the canoe. Swimming to land was difficult and treacherous. The sea swept them against the reef on the south side of Cross Island, and Ross received numerous cuts and bruises, but both managed to make land where they stayed the rest of the night. On Saturday, August 7th, 8 natives arrived bringing a message from a coast watcher, instructing the senior officer to go with the natives to Wana Wana. Kennedy and Ross had the natives paddle them to the island where the rest of the survivors were, and all were made as comfortable as possible. That afternoon, Kennedy, hidden under ferns in the native boat, was taken to the coast watcher, arriving about 1600. There it was arranged that PT boats would rendezvous with him in Ferguson Passage that evening at 22:30. Accordingly, he was taken to the rendezvous point, finally made contact with the PTs at 23:15, and directed the boats to the rest of the survivors. Their rescue was effected without mishap, and they returned to the base at Rendover at 05:30 on August 8th, 7 days after the ramming of PT-109 in Blackett Strait.